The High Council of the Tri-Galactic Accord was not a place of debate anymore. It was a morgue. On the central screens, the world of Krios 4, the jewel of the Vraxian hegemony, was being consumed. It wasn't fire or orbital bombardment. It was the vial. A sentient, multidimensional infection that turned stone into flesh and flesh into screaming, bioluminescent glass. Our fleets are useless, High Arbiter Vax roared, his mandibles dripping with stress fluid. Every ship we send near the vial is integrated into its mass. We are feeding it. The 4,000 delegates sat in frozen terror. Even the mighty Krell, who boasted of their planet cracker missiles, stood silent. Their weapons were designed to break things, but you cannot break a fever with a hammer. In the very last row, as usual, sat the human delegation. They weren't wearing the ornate silks of the Vraxians or the power armor of the Krell. They were wearing sterile white lab coats and carrying data tablets that looked like toys compared to the Council's holographic arrays. Dr. Aris Thorne, a woman with graying hair and eyes that looked like they had seen the birth and death of stars, stood up. She didn't wait to be called upon. She didn't ask for permission. She simply tapped a button on her tablet, and the human back row data feed overrode the main screen. "Arbiter, you're looking at this as a war," Thorne said, her voice cutting through the panic like a chilled blade. "That's your first mistake. You don't fight a plague with a fleet. You treat it with surgery." The room erupted in mocking chittering. "Surgery?" Vax hissed. "The vial has consumed 3 systems. It is a god of entropy. What can your doctors do against the end of reality?" Thorne adjusted her glasses, her expression flat. "We've spent 73 cycles being your janitors and your accountants because we wanted to stay out of your heroic wars. But Earth has dealt with entities like the vial before. In our archives, we call this a Class 9 cellular deviation. It's not a god, it's a parasite that hasn't met its match yet." She leaned forward, her image projected 10 meters high in the center of the hall. "The Terran Medical Corps is offering a triage intervention. We will contain the infection. We will sanitize the affected sectors, and we will perform a total extraction of the vial's core." "And the price?" the Krell commander demanded, his voice suspicious. "The price is simple," Thorne replied. "Once we start the surgery, your fleet stay 10 light-years away. If any ship crosses the sterile zone without our permission, we will treat them as a secondary infection. And we are very efficient at amputating secondary infections." Before the Council could even vote, a proximity alert screamed. 12 human ships had just jumped into the Krios system. They weren't the massive, jagged dreadnoughts the aliens expected. They were sleek, bone-white cylinders with no visible gun ports. "They're insane," Vax whispered, watching the human ships fly directly toward the mass of the vial. "They're going to be consumed in seconds." But as the first human ship, the EMS Nightingale, approached the writhing mass of glass and flesh, it didn't fire a missile. It emitted a pulse of null light that made the vial recoil for the first time in recorded history. "Scalpel Team 1, begin the incision." Thorne's voice echoed in the chamber. Suddenly, the white hull of the Nightingale split open, revealing a focusing lens that glowed with the heat of 1,000 suns. A beam of pure, concentrated anti-reality shot out, slicing a perfect 300-mile-long trench through the vial's body. The screaming of the entity could be heard through every psychic sensor in the galaxy. "Wait!" Arbiter Vax gasped. "Those aren't hospital ships. They're whatever the patient needs them to be," Thorne interrupted, her eyes never leaving the screen. "And right now, the galaxy needs a very, very sharp knife. The surgery has begun, but as the humans cut into the vial, they find something inside the plague that shouldn't exist. A signature belonging to one of the Council's own members. Who infected the galaxy? And what happens when Dr. Thorne decides the Council itself is the disease?" The EMS Nightingale did not move with the lumbering, heavy-shielded grace of a warship. It moved with the terrifying, jittery precision of a hummingbird-sized laser. As the vial, that pulsating mass of sentient, crystalline cancer, screeched across the psychic frequencies of every being in the system, the human ship simply adjusted its positioning thrusters. To the High Council watching from light-years away, it looked like a dance. To the Vraxian hegemony fleet still lingering in the system, it looked like an insult. Admiral Krell, commander of the Vraxian Iron Guard, could not stomach the sight. His dreadnought, the Breaker of Suns, was a 3-kilometer-long monument to violence. Yet it was being told to stand down by a hospital ship that looked like a sleek medicine capsule. "They are cutting into the vial with mining lasers," Krell barked over the open channel, his scales flush with an angry, mottled red. "They are going to trigger a mass mutation event. All ships move to intercept. If the humans won't step aside, we will assist them by force." Inside the Archive of Solitude back on Earth, Dr. Aris Thorne didn't even blink as the Vraxian fleet began to burn their engines toward the sterile zone. She was looking at a 3D biometric scan of the Krios system. To her, the stars weren't points of light. They were nodes in a nervous system. And right now, the Vraxian fleet was acting like a rogue pathogen. "Admiral Krell," Thorne's voice broke through the Vraxian bridge's internal comms, bypassing their military-grade encryption as if it were a child's toy. "You are currently entering a pressurized surgical field. Your engine emissions are introducing heavy isotopes into a delicate environment. You are a contaminant. Turn back immediately." "I do not take orders from a veterinarian," Krell screamed, his pride blinding him to the fact that his targeting computers were failing to lock onto the white ships. "We are the protectors of this sector." "You are a complication," Thorne whispered. She turned to her console. "Nightingale, the patient is agitated. Perform a localized debridement. Clear the field." The High Council gasped as one of the other human ships, the EMS Blackwell, didn't turn its broadside toward the Vraxian fleet. Instead, it deployed a series of medical drones, tiny silver spheres that accelerated to relativistic speeds in seconds. They didn't explode. They didn't fire plasma. They simply passed through the Vraxian destroyers, vibrating at a frequency that caused the alien ship's structural integrity to simply dissolve. Within 10 seconds, 4 Vraxian destroyers were reduced to neat piles of floating scrap metal. No fire, no debris clouds, just clean surgical cuts. "That was your first warning, Admiral," Thorne said, her voice dropping to a register that made the High Arbiter Vax shiver. "In our world, malpractice has consequences. Now stand down while we find out why this infection has your government's digital signature all over its DNA." The room went deathly silent. On the main screen, the Nightingale had successfully extracted a tissue sample from the vial's core. As the holographic data resolved, it showed a series of complex artificial coding sequences. These weren't the result of natural evolution or cosmic entropy. They were manufactured. And the encryption keys used to build the vial were identical to the ones the Vraxian hegemony used for their own high-security vaults. "Arbiter Vax," Dr. Thorne said, her gaze shifting to the leader of the council. "We're no longer just dealing with a plague, we're dealing with a biological weapon. And according to my diagnosis, the Vraxian hegemony didn't fail to stop the vial. They are the vial." Suddenly, the Vraxian delegation in the council chamber stood up, their eyes glowing with the same sickly, iridescent light as the plague on the screen. They hadn't just been outvoted, they had been activated. The High Council chamber of the Tri-Galactic Accord was no longer a place of diplomacy. It was a hot zone. The Vraxian delegates, once the most prestigious members of the front row, were undergoing a grotesque, rapid-onset metamorphosis. Their chitinous carapaces were cracking open, replaced by jagged, iridescent crystalline structures that pulsed with the same sickly light as the plague-consuming Krios 4. They weren't just dying. They were becoming biological transmitters for the vial. Arbiter Vax stumbled back, his guards raising their sonic rifles, but Dr. Aris Thorne didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a weapon. She simply touched a command icon on her tablet. "Nurse, sedate the delegation," Thorne said calmly. From the ceiling of the back row human sector, 12 pressurized canisters hissed. A fine violet mist descended over the transforming Vraxians. It wasn't poison, it was a targeted molecular stabilizer. The crystalline growth slowed, then froze mid-burst, leaving the delegates in a state of suspended biological animation. "They aren't monsters yet," Thorne explained to the trembling council. "They're just symptomatic. We've put them into a localized stasis. We'll deal with the inflammation here once we finish the primary procedure in the Krios system. Now, focus. We're moving into the macro-surgical phase." On the main viewer, the scale of the human intervention shifted from the microscopic to the planetary. The 12 human medical ships, now joined by a massive 5-kilometer-long vessel called the EMS Hippocrates, were moving into a precise geometric formation around the inner planets of the Krios system. "You see, Arbiter," Thorne's voice took on the tone of a lead surgeon explaining a routine bypass to a terrified family. "The vial isn't an invading army. It's a systemic disorder. It has attached itself to the gravitational ley lines of the Krios sun. To remove it without killing the patient, the star system, we have to perform a temporary relocation of the vital organs. The council watched in collective, breathless silence as the Hippocrates ignited its primary engines. It didn't fire a beam. Instead, it deployed a gravity forceps array, a series of high-density localized singularities that began to warp the fabric of space itself. Krios 2, a small, rocky planet that was the primary breeding ground for the vial, began to move. It wasn't being destroyed. It was being slid out of its orbit. The humans were physically rearranging the solar system, moving a multi-billion-ton mass as if it were a tumor being pulled away from a healthy artery. By shifting Krios 2 40,000 kilometers north of the ecliptic plane, Thorne narrated, we break the vial's connection to the sun's solar winds. We isolate the infection. We create a sterile field for the final extraction. Admiral Krell, watching from his crippled flagship, found his voice. You are moving planets? To perform an extraction? This is madness. The orbital mechanics, the tidal forces, you'll destroy everything. We've lived on a Class 12 death world for millions of years, Admiral, Thorne replied, her eyes reflecting the blue glow of the gravity forceps. We learned early on that if you want to survive the planet, you have to know how to move the mountains. Humans don't see space as a void to be conquered. We see it as a body to be healed. And right now, we're about to cut the heart out of your god. As Krios 2 reached its new temporary position, the iridescent mass of the vial began to thrash. It realized it was being quarantined. The crystalline structure on the planet's surface reached out toward the Krios sun, attempting to bridge the gap with a massive trillion-mile-long filament of sentient glass. It's reaching for a blood supply, Thorne noted, her voice hardening. Scalpel teams, prepare for a total excision, and someone tell the council to look away. This part gets a bit messy. A blinding, clinical white light erupted from the human ships, a frequency that didn't burn the eyes but seemed to vibrate the very soul. The scalpel was no longer a laser. It was a localized collapse of reality designed to erase the vial from existence without touching the planet beneath it. But as the cut began, the sensors on the Hippocrates screamed a warning. The vial wasn't just a parasite, it was a doorway, and something on the other side was starting to push back. The surgery has hit a complication. The vial isn't just an infection, it's a sentient anchor for something much larger and much older. Can Dr. Thorne finish the excision before the patient's father arrives to stop the operation? The bridge of the EMS Hippocrates was a cathedral of clinical silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic, heartbeat-like pulse of the gravity forceps. But that silence was shattered when the scalpel made its first deep cut into Krios 2. The rift didn't just bleed energy, it bled intent. On the main screens, the vial's iridescent, crystalline structure began to vibrate at a frequency that bypassed the vacuum of space, echoing directly into the minds of everyone in the Krios system. It wasn't a sound, it was a memory of hunger. Doctor, we have a breach, the chief tactical nurse reported, her voice steady despite the fact that the spatial rift was now a mile-wide tear in reality. The vial isn't just a pathogen, it's a sensory organ, and the source just felt the incision. Before Dr. Thorne could respond, a new alert flashed on her tablet. Admiral Krell, his fleet crippled and his pride incinerated, had decided on a final, desperate gamble. He believed that human medical technology, the gravity forceps, the anti-reality scalpels, was the only thing that could save his transforming species. He didn't want a cure. He wanted the power of the cure. Hegemony ships execute Operation Last Rites. Krell's voice crackled over the emergency channel. Seize the Hippocrates. If we cannot be healed, we will be the masters of the tool. The remains of the Vraxian fleet, nearly 80 vessels, ignited their remaining thrusters in a suicidal charge toward the human medical flagship. They weren't firing, they were attempting to board. Harpoon cables and boarding pods were prepped. They thought the humans, being doctors, would hesitate to kill a desperate patient. Dr. Thorne didn't even look up from the spatial rift where a massive, multi-dimensional limb was beginning to pull itself into their reality. Admiral Krell, she said, her voice dripping with the disappointment of a professional who has been interrupted during a critical procedure. You are interfering with a life-saving operation. This is no longer a triage situation. This is a malpractice suit. Nurse, she added calmly, initiate the security audit protocol. Range, 10 light years. The Hippocrates did not fire a single beam of light. Instead, it emitted a low-frequency hum that seemed to tune the very atoms of the surrounding space. On the human tactical displays, the Vraxian ships were no longer metallic hulls. They were transparent blueprints. The human stethoscope sensors, originally designed to monitor the cellular health of entire colonies, now heard the mechanical vibrations of every firing pin, every coolant pump, and every heartbeat inside the Vraxian fleet. Audit complete, the AI chirped. Identifying critical failures. With the clinical efficiency of a computer deleting a corrupted file, the Hippocrates sent a series of targeted acoustic vibration pulses. In an instant, the Vraxian ships didn't explode. They simply ceased to function. Engines stalled as the pulses caused fuel lines to forget how to flow. Boarding pods lost their seals, weapon systems decalibrated by a fraction of a millimeter, rendering them useless. Admiral Krell watched his flagship's bridge go dark. His crew was alive, but they were trapped in a silent, floating tomb. "You aren't warriors," Krell whispered into the darkness of his own bridge. "You're gods." "No," Thorne's voice replied, projected into his cabin. "We're just the ones who know exactly where your pressure points are. We've studied life for 10,000 years, Admiral. We know every way it can be broken. We chose to fix it. Do not force us to change our specialty." She turned her attention back to the rift. The limb of the source, a prehistoric, extra-dimensional entity that had seeded the vial as a way to harvest reality, had fully emerged. It was a mass of shifting obsidian geometry that dwarfed the Hippocrates. It didn't have a face, but it had a gaze. And that gaze was locked on Dr. Thorne. The entity let out a psychic shriek that shattered the viewports of the Vraxian ships. It wasn't attacking, it was claiming. It viewed the galaxy as its dinner plate, and it saw the human medical team as a pesky antibiotic trying to stop a meal. "Patient's father has arrived," the nurse reported, her hands flying across the console. "It's initiating a systemic shutdown of the sector's physics." "Excellent," Dr. Thorne said, a sharp clinical glint in her eyes. "I've been waiting for a specimen this large. Scalpel teams, prepare for a total body scan. If it wants to eat this galaxy, it's going to have to pass a physical first." The source lunged, its geometric limbs wrapping around the Hippocrates. But as it touched the bone-white hull, the ship didn't crumple. It began to glow with a brilliant, golden, immune response light. The hull of the EMS Hippocrates groaned with a sound that shouldn't exist in a vacuum. A deep, subspatial metallic shriek as the source tightened its geometric grip. This entity, an extra-dimensional harvester of reality, didn't just exert physical pressure. It exerted ontological pressure. It was trying to rewrite the atoms of the human ship into the same brittle, crystalline glass that had consumed Krios 4. On the bridge, the lights had shifted from a cool, clinical blue to a searing, defensive gold. Dr. Aris Thorne stood in the center of the chaos, her feet planted firmly as the deck tilted. She wasn't watching the rift or the massive limbs of the god entity outside. She was staring at a microscopic sequence of code, scrolling across her primary contact lens. "Its structural integrity is based on a recursive Fibonacci sequence," Thorne observed, her voice as calm as a surgeon discussing a minor skin graft. "It's beautiful in a predatory sort of way. It assumes that because its mathematics are superior to the rest of the galaxy, it is immune to the laws of the patient. It thinks it's the apex predator because it hasn't met a species that can read its DNA in real time." "Doctor, the hull is at 60% capacity," the chief nurse shouted over the psychic feedback of the source's scream. "The Vraxian survivors in the council chamber are starting to vibrate. If we don't act, the activation will go global. Initiate the viral suture protocol," Thorne commanded. "We aren't going to kill it. Killing it leaves a vacuum, and the universe hates a vacuum. We're going to vaccinate it." Across the external hull of the Hippocrates, thousands of injection ports opened. They didn't fire missiles. They released a cloud of golden, bioluminescent dust, trillions of human medical nanites, each one programmed with a countercode derived from humanity's own history of surviving Class 12 Death World pathogens. The nanites didn't attack the source's limbs. They integrated with them. The High Council, watching the feed in stunned horror, saw the obsidian geometry of the source begin to change. Where the golden dust touched the entity, the dark, jagged crystals began to smooth out. The iridescent, sickly purple light was replaced by the steady, clinical white of the human medical fleet. "What are you doing to it?" Arbiter Vax gasped, watching the god of the vial begin to thrash, not in anger, but in confusion. "We're performing a non-consensual genetic overhaul," Thorne replied, her fingers dancing across a holographic keyboard. "The vial was a wild strain of reality parasite. We are turning it into a domesticated immune system. We're rewriting its core directives. Instead of consume and replicate, its new primary function is identify and neutralize contaminants." The transformation was violent and beautiful. The source's limbs, once reaching out to devour the Krios system, suddenly stiffened. The spatial rift behind it didn't close. It stabilized, turning into a shimmering, permanent doorway of golden light. The entity itself began to unfurl, its obsidian scales shedding like dead skin, to reveal a core of pure, radiant energy that mirrored the human Red Cross emblem. "The vaccine is taking hold," Thorne narrated. "It is no longer the source of the vial. It is now the HDF Sentinel-01. It has been inoculated with the Terran Charter of Biological Preservation. It won't eat your planets anymore, Arbiter. It will protect them. It will scan every ship, every station, and every colony for the slightest hint of artificial pathogens or extra-dimensional rot. And if it finds any," she paused, a sharp, terrifying smile crossing her face, "it will perform an immediate, autonomous amputation of the infected area. It is the galaxy's new immune system, and Earth holds the only medical license to operate it." On Krios 2, the crystalline plague didn't just die, it transformed. The screaming glass turned into a lush, bioluminescent flora that began to rapidly repair the planet's atmosphere. The infection had become the cure. But as the Hippocrates began to disengage its gravity forceps, a new signal emerged from the newly civilized rift. It wasn't the source. It was a transmission from the deep void behind the entity. A message from the manufacturers of the vial who had just realized their biological weapon had been hijacked and turned against them. "Doctor," the nurse whispered, her face going pale, "we have a response from the architects of the vial. They say the malpractice suit has just been escalated to a life support termination. The manufacturers have been provoked, and they are sending more than just a plague. They are sending the surgeons who built the vial to reclaim their stolen property. Does humanity have enough medicine to stop an army of creators?" The life support termination protocol didn't arrive as a fleet of warships or a barrage of plasma. It arrived as a fundamental shift in the Planck constant of the Krios sector. On the bridge of the EMS Hippocrates, the air began to feel thin, not in oxygen, but in existence itself. The very laws of physics that allowed atoms to hold together were being remotely edited. "Doctor, the local gravitational constant is fluctuating by plus or minus 12%, the chief nurse reported. Her voice strained as she fought against the sudden weight of her own body. "The manufacturers, the sovereign weavers, are deauthorizing the sector's reality. They aren't fighting us, they're just turning us off." High Arbiter Vax and the remaining council members watched in paralyzed horror as the stars on the main viewer began to lose their color, turning a flat, unrendered gray. The iridescent beauty of the newly christened HDF Sentinel-01, formerly the source, began to flicker. The Weavers, the ancient architects who had seeded the vial as a cosmic recycling program for inefficient life, had arrived to reclaim their stolen assets. 3 moon-sized vessels, geometric and cold, phased into the system. They didn't have bridges or windows. They were massive, sentient hard drives designed to manage the data of the universe. "Tension. Unauthorized biomass," a voice boomed. Not through the speakers, but through the very marrow of their bones. "You have subverted a Class 9 reclamation protocol. The entity known as Vial is proprietary technology of the Sovereign Weavers. Revert all genetic edits immediately or suffer systemic deletion." Dr. Aris Thorne didn't tremble. She didn't even drop her coffee. She simply adjusted her surgical mask and tapped a command on her console that sent a cease and desist order through the stabilized rift. "Listen to me, you overgrown calculators," Thorne said, her voice amplified by the Hippocrates subspatial transmitters. "You might have built the house, but we're the ones living in it. You allowed a sentient cancer to ravage this sector because it was efficient. In our world, that's not engineering, it's criminal negligence. And as the chief medical officer of the Terran Federation, I am officially placing this entire galaxy under professional guardianship." "Threat detected," the Weavers responded. Initiating formatting of Sector 001. The space around the Hippocrates began to pixelate. The matter of the ship was being reduced to raw data, preparing to be erased. But Thorne had spent 73 cycles studying the vial, and she knew that the Weaver's technology relied on a specific harmonic frequency to maintain their authority over matter. "Nurse, initiate the recovery room protocol," Thorne commanded. "If they want to turn off the lights, we'll just have to provide our own power." The Hippocrates didn't fire. Instead, it linked with the HDF Sentinel-01. The vaccinated god and the human hospital became a single closed-loop circuit. They didn't fight the Weaver's deletions, they overwrote them. Trillions of human medical nanites carrying the Terran patent of life flooded the sector. They acted as a subspatial anchor, holding the atoms of the Krios system together through sheer stubborn human will. "You call us unauthorized biomass?" Thorne whispered, her eyes glowing with the golden light of the Sentinel. "We call ourselves the Survivors. We've been fighting extinction since we were crawling in the mud. We don't need your authorization to exist." The golden light of the Sentinel suddenly pulsed outward, hitting the moon-sized Weaver ships. It didn't destroy them. It infected them with humanity. The nanites began uploading billions of years of human art, music, grief, and medical ethics into the Weaver's sterile databanks. The machines that saw the universe as an equation were suddenly forced to process the irrationality of a species that would sacrifice everything to save a single child. The Weaver's ships began to shudder. Their geometric perfection warped as they struggled to calculate the value of a sunset or the efficiency of a tear. "What is happening?" Arbiter Vax gasped. "They're in recovery," Thorne said, leaning back in her chair. "We're forcing them to experience the weight of every life they've recycled. It's a bit of a shock to the system. Think of it as a very aggressive form of therapy." But as the Weaver ships began to glow with the same golden human light, a final, darker signal emerged from the deep void. The Weavers weren't the highest power. They were just the janitors of a much larger, much more ancient landlord. And he was finally coming home to see why his Petri dish was screaming. The arrival of the Primal Architect, the being the Weavers referred to as the landlord, did not happen in space. It happened in the mind of every sentient creature within 100 light years. It was a crushing, absolute presence, like the weight of 1 billion suns pressing against the collective consciousness of the galaxy. The Krios system didn't just dim, it began to stutter, the frames of reality skipping as if the universe were a failing holographic projection. "Insufficient data," the landlord's voice resonated, a sound that felt like the grinding of tectonic plates at the dawn of time. "The Petri dish is contaminated. The experiment is declared a failure, initiating total recycling." High Arbiter Vax fell to his knees in the council chamber, his eyes weeping iridescent fluid. The other delegates were catatonic, their brains unable to process a being that existed before the concept of before. Even the moon-sized Weaver ships, now glowing with human gold, began to power down, their ancient programming recognizing their master's override. But on the bridge of the EMS Hippocrates, Dr. Aris Thorne wasn't kneeling. She was standing at her terminal, her fingers moving with a frantic, surgical rhythm. "Nurse, target the landlord's ego center," Thorne commanded, her voice a sharp, clinical rasp through the psychic static. "He thinks he's the owner of this property. Let's show him the maintenance lien we've been building for 73 cycles." "Doctor, he's deleting the atomic weights of the inner planets," the nurse shouted. "Krios 1 is turning into a gas. We don't have the power to stop a primal." "We don't need power," Thorne said, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying brilliance. "We need a malpractice lawyer, or rather the medical equivalent." Thorne didn't fire a weapon. She initiated a universal data sync. Through the HDF Sentinel-01 and the hijacked Weaver ships, she projected a single, massive file directly into the landlord's consciousness. It wasn't a message of war. It was a medical history of the galaxy. "You call this a failed experiment?" Thorne's voice was projected with such force it rattled the spatial rift. "We call it a patient in recovery. You've been an absentee landlord for 3 billion years, letting your Weavers spread a sentient cancer like the vial because you were too lazy to perform a proper audit. Under the Terran Interstellar Medical Code, you are guilty of gross planetary negligence." The landlord paused. The recycling of the planet slowed. A massive nebulous eye, larger than a star, opened in the void, focusing on the tiny, bone-white human ship. "You, a microbe? Challenge the architect?" "I'm not challenging you," Thorne said, tapping a final key. "I'm billing you. We've just spent the last 11 hours cleaning up your mess. We've vaccinated your god, reprogrammed your janitors, and saved a species you were ready to flush down the cosmic drain. The energy expenditure, the intellectual property of the vaccine, and the labor costs of the Terran Medical Corps. It all adds up to a very specific number. A digital invoice appeared on every screen in the galaxy. It was a number so large it required its own mathematical notation. "We don't want your reality," Thorne continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "We want the keys. You are hereby declared medically unfit to manage this sector. We are placing the Tri-Galactic Accord under Terran guardianship. Your experiment is over. This is now a recovery ward." The landlord roared, a psychic wave that should have shattered the Hippocrates. But the HDF Sentinel-01, the vaccinated god, moved. It didn't attack. It simply stood in the way, its new human-coded immune system absorbing the blow. The Weaver ships joined in, creating a harmonic barrier of pure, stubborn human ethics. The landlord realized the truth. He could destroy them, but it would require reformatting the entire universe. An energy cost that even he couldn't afford. The humans hadn't built a better gun. They had made themselves too expensive to kill. "The bill will be paid," the landlord rumbled, his presence beginning to recede back into the deep void. "But the warden must remain vigilant. The galaxy is fragile. We've been living on a Class 12 death world for a long time," Thorne said, watching the stars return to their natural colors. "We know exactly how fragile life is. That's why we're so good at protecting it." The rift closed. The landlord was gone. But as the council chamber began to cheer, they stopped when they saw the second page of the bill. It wasn't addressed to the landlord. It was addressed to them. "Arbiter Vax," Dr. Thorne said, her image appearing in the council hall. "The surgery was a success. The patient is stable. Now, let's talk about your post-op care." She scrolled through the terms. Total demilitarization of all species. All warships to be converted into mobile clinics. The back row is now the head of the medical board. "The era of the Predator is over," Thorne concluded, sipping a fresh cup of coffee. "The galaxy is now under medical supervision. And trust me, you really don't want to see what happens when we have to perform an involuntary committal. The galaxy is saved, but the doctors are now the undisputed wardens of the stars." As humanity moves from the back row to the head of the table, a new question arises. Who heals the healers when the burden of a galaxy becomes too much to bear?